Well, hello, and thank you for joining me today. I've got a very special guest for you today who's been talking to some of the best health experts around the world and exploring how you can change your health by changing your mind. Dhru Purohit, thank you so much for joining me today.
Dr. Stephen Lin, an honor to be here and also a pleasure to call you a friend, brother. I've learned so much from you over the years.
Absolutely. And vice versa, like that's really kind of was my inspiration for lining this up. I mean, you're a very busy guy, so thank you firstly for spending the time to have a chat with me today. But the work that you've done and your story over the last few years, I think really kind of tells a real story on where our health system and what some of the most forward-thinking practitioners have been doing in the last say decade. And I thought it would be really interesting to dive into that and to just kind of tell a little bit of your story about how you got into talking about the connection between the mind and our health. But also, what are some of the best and most forward-thinking practitioners out there doing today? Tell us, you originally framed your podcast, the Broken Brain podcast, which is now the Dhru Purohit show, and you've aired a number of docuseries on the Broken Brain and also to longevity. And this whole idea around how we shape our existence. And then there's this real kind of conversation in the background of how our mind and how our thoughts and how we influence our own health through these modalities. How did you start thinking about this? What was your was it a personal journey, or what was your kind of way of starting to think, well, there's these health issues. How do we approach these in a different way?
Yeah, it's a great question. And fundamentally today, I look at it completely differently than when it started off. And so my background is I'm not a clinician or a practitioner like you or many of the guests that I have on my podcast, Nobel Prize winners, researchers, other things like that. I'm not any of those things. I am an individual who is really always super into entrepreneurship. My goal in life and sort of what I'm best at is building up businesses and companies that can help elevate potentially humanity and also spread the word about stuff, and I've partnered some great people over the years. So today, the way that I look at like the brain and body connection is a fundamental truth that I didn't understand when I got started. And today, the way I look at it, which is a good contrast to just mention, is what you do to the body, you do to the brain, right? What you do to your body, you do to your brain. No organ systems in our body, especially our brain, operate in silos. They're all interconnected. Now, I didn't know this many years ago. In fact, I went through a few different health issues when I was in university. And primarily, I noticed, well-intentioned, I embarked down the pathway of exploring a new diet at the time. I actually became vegan primarily because out of a good thing, I had really bad acne that started in my high school years. And I went to a conference in Los Angeles, part of this community that I'm from. And I heard one of the speakers there share that, hey, there's this thing called gut inflammation. And sometimes when gut inflammation is high, it could make your acne and your pimples on your face a little worse. And some people are more sensitive to dairy, and dairy can be one of the triggers for people when it comes to gut inflammation. This is the year 2000, right? So this is like 20 years ago plus. Like nobody was talking about gut inflammation, definitely at a non-medical conference that was there. And I listened to the speaker and I thought, this is really interesting. So I ended up cutting dairy out of my diet, and I was eating processed dairy at the time, not the high quality stuff that's a little bit more awareness on today. I was eating processed factory farm dairy. I was mostly vegetarian. So that was one of my main sort of animal sources inside of my diet. And well-intentioned, I cut out basically all animal foods out of my diet, but I became a processed food vegan. And yes, my acne went away in the short term, and I actually did really well. A lot of people that go on these different diets, they do well for a period of time. And then sometimes after that honeymoon phase, things change. So when things changed for me, I was in university And I just actually genuinely felt like my brain wasn't working in the best capacity as possible. I was eating so many refined vegetable oils, high omega-6 seed oils, things like that, that I had actually my first major bout without even really having a history of depression. And that sent me on a journey to actually start researching and asking questions to people who are way more qualified than I am about what the science shows when it comes to why do we get depressed? Why do we lose our focus? Why do we not have the energy that we want to? Why do we lose our drive? And does our diet and lifestyle play into it in any way that we can control? Because the thing is, Stephen, is that if we can realize that we're part of the problem, then that's a good thing, because that means that we can do something to impact the solution. So all those questions started at that time period.
It's so powerful and interesting to think, obviously it's been 2 decades now, but our perspective on this has changed so much. And I had a bit of childhood, adolescent acne too. And you think about inflammation in the body, and at the time you just didn't make that connection at all, and how our perspectives have changed in really not that larger time span, and how we've really kind of started to reshape understanding what's going on inside the body. So when we think about this inflammation, you began to talk about inflammation there, and when we think about how this is affecting our system, and the first thing, probably the first body of scientific evidence that really began to describe this was this gut-brain connection, right? That there's this huge system inside of us that is both a microbial environment and also speaking to our immune system. And then this flood of scientific evidence just came out 2008. You were talking about a conference in 2000, but scientific evidence takes so long to kind of catch up, doesn't it? So this idea that the gut-brain connection and the chronic digestive issues are formed by what we put into our body really wasn't something that we were kind of brought up with. But then today we're starting to see that people can reverse these kind of issues. How have you've had some recent interviews on chronic gut issues such as Crohn's and things like colitis, and these issues that people are suffering very commonly today. How would you say that people are starting to frame these conditions? And there was a recent interview with, it was Nishita Patel, wasn't it, on Crohn's? And what would you say where some of the advances are moving into understanding this as a gut-brain connection and how we reverse this?
Yeah, well, I think what's important for people to remember is that, I mean, the father of modern, medicine in the context of, history, Socrates, he said, are his gut, right? Like he would always talk about that as part of one of the main principles that he would share with, in his teachings and in his writings. And let thy food be thy medicine and thy medicine be thy food. So we're now obviously catching up because we have the research, we have the tools, we have tests, we have the infrastructure to be able to actually understand the mechanisms behind all these. And I just want to share that I like to talk about it and I like to interview the experts on it, but by no means am I the expert out there that's doing the research or qualified. I like to think of myself as the hype man for the industry. I like to get people excited and get content out there so that people like me, I'm just an average person who's out there trying to better my life. And that's most individuals that are there. So I think that one of the foundational things is that, we are starting to understand that our gut, just like I was talking about our brain earlier, that it doesn't live in a silo, that in our gut, that we have this bidirectional superhighway that specifically, we're talking about gut and brain connection. We have this bidirectional superhighway that connects the gut and the brain. People have heard about it before. It's called the vagus nerve. Now, it's a lot more complicated than just one system of communication and a nerve back and forth. But when we think about eating and digesting, that's really the outside world, right? When we're chewing and we're swallowing and we're digesting and it goes through our stomach into our large intestines, small intestines, everything like that. That's still our body's outside version of the world. It's only when those foods are broken down and they pass through our tight junctions, and we have that barrier, which many people have heard leaky gut as being a common term. When we have those tight junctions having holes in them from our modern day lifestyle, too much antibiotics, additives in processed foods, we're now starting to understand, and people are highlighting, that the food that we eat on a daily basis actually can impact the rest of our body. Perfect example is when we eat certain types of foods that leave us having holes, like modernized wheat instead of native wheat, which is what we kind of grew up on. Modernized wheat that is grown in a capacity that has higher amounts of gluten inside of it. We know that creates holes inside of these tight junctions that separate the outside world from the inside world. And there's so much emerging research that's coming in the space that shows that just in a simplest level, when people eat something like gluten, again, super modernized, wheat process that's there, we can actually hype up our immune system. After a year of the pandemic, everybody's been talking about how do we get our immune system up, up, up. Well, actually, what a lot of researchers have showed me on my podcast is that we don't want our immune system to be overreactive. In fact, many of the issues, the autoimmune issues that we're dealing with, are from a hyper reactive immune system that is letting too many things into our body that's causing it to freak out, which can have all sorts of impact on modern chronic diseases that we're all dealing with, and inflammatory pathways that create everything from brain fog to long-term and create like Crohn's and colitis, to even being some of the cytokines that have been researched and connected to nerve damage when it comes to multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and many other conditions that are there. So I think that more attention is being placed on the exact mechanisms, but we have known about these things in Ayurveda, Chinese medicine. There's been a deep history and study of gut health for long periods of time, but we need the science to catch up to be able to explain the exact ways these pathways end up happening.
I remember when I was diving into the research in how vitamin D affected the body, thinking about the mechanisms of how we understand tooth decay in a different way, and then seeing these connections as to how vitamin D modulates the immune system, and how the vitamin D receptor on all immune cells creates an decreases the response of the immune system. And it's kind of counterintuitive when you first think of it, but what you just described really is how an immune system should be. It should be completely calm and not using energy when it doesn't have to. And it's so interesting that we see this idea of kind of becoming hyped up in terms of bringing ourselves as as defensive as possible. But really, we should be as calm as possible. And it's interesting how this this kind of movement to decreasing our baseline stresses really do kind of come into play as to how we affect this gut-brain system. It's so fascinating. And also too, your mention of the vagus nerve is something that we really see so often, especially in the mouth, that people just disconnected from this parasympathetic calming part of our nervous system that really kicks off the whole digestive system. And you describe it so well in how we really understand this connection between the gut and the brain. Dhru, there's a lot of people out there suffering from chronic health issues, and a lot of people describe low energy, and just not feeling like they're that they're operating at their best. Have you seen or discussed with doctors connections between what people are feeling with how they're feeling in terms of their energy and certain health conditions, and how or some of the approaches you've heard that have been effective in addressing these?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, we talk about that quite often. And it's amazing to think about our body, fundamentally, just like I was sharing earlier, what you do to your body, you do to your brain. So all the things that we're putting into our body, lack of energy regulation or poor metabolic health, the same thing that happens to the body ends up happening to the brain. There's some really interesting research that came out before I go into your question about from a gentleman named Dr. Ben Bickman, who is a PhD researcher out of Brigham Young University, who started highlighting some evidence that's out there when it comes to migraines. Migraines, something that a lot of people suffer from. Well, it turns out that a lot of people who deal with migraines, there's multiple root issues that are there, but a big chunk of individuals have an energy gap when it comes to the brain. Their brain is not using or has gaps in energy in terms of how it processes glutones versus using fat as fuel. And when we are mixed up and we have poor metabolic health, we're on our way to pre-diabetes or we have type 2 diabetes, we're more likely to be somebody who suffers from migraine health. So thinking about blood sugar regulation and thinking about our basic core energy usage during the day, the fact that that could have an impact on migraines that we see as completely a separate topic is fascinating, right? So going back to your question about energy, we talk about it a ton. And most recently, we've had on some incredible people that have shared on some of a few fundamentals. I'll just share 4 just to start off with. Off the topic of metabolic health, what's getting a lot more attention, especially here in the United States, is that so many more people are wearing continuous glucose monitors because we're seeing that our out of control blood sugar. Traditionally, when we grow up in the rainforest, the plains of Africa, or wherever we come from, these modern day hunter-gatherer societies, we were not exposed to many things in the day, minus pure honey, which was available to a lot of hunter-gatherer groups that were out there. And Dr. Weston Price, right? You've done a lot of research in that capacity. He highlighted this. We weren't exposed to these carbohydrate sources of concentrated sugars that could spike our blood sugar and put us on a roller coaster, going all the way up and then end up crashing a little later on. And if we look at our modern day diet is one where if we would map out most people's blood sugar on a daily basis, we'd see that they'd be on this roller coaster of up and down cycles. Now, blood sugar has a connection to insulin, and insulin can ultimately lead to, in our current capacity, people suffering with insulin resistance. I won't go into all the mechanisms of why that ends up happening, but on a most fundamental level, you see that one of the main reasons that people are lacking energy during their day is just poor metabolic health. They don't have stable sources of fuel that primarily come from healthy fats and proteins in their diet. And they have irregular sources of fuel that primarily come from processed carbohydrates in the forms of wheats and breads and sugars that are in processed foods. And that puts their body in an energy gap where it's constantly playing catch up when it comes to regulating its own blood sugar. Another thing, Stephen, that gets a lot of attention on our podcast is something just so fundamental, yet so many people are suffering from, is sleep. I know you talk about it. One of the biggest things that I learned from you, because sleep has so many different factors, is the power of actually fixing how we breathe. When it comes to our basic core function of breathing, how things like mouth taping can be extremely helpful when it comes to improving our sleep. I don't know if you've done any episodes on this topic recently for you guys on your podcast.
Yeah, we definitely cover sleep a lot. It comes up a lot because it sits within that functional dental space where we're dealing with how we fix mouth breathing and all of the different styles of sleep issues, especially in children too, because a lot of parents out there battling with it. And sleep is such a fundamental, it's such a fundamental pillar of how the body heals. And especially for people that are maybe battling, we talked about energy, they're almost always not sleeping well. So it just comes up again and again and again. And I've heard you interview a lot of great people on the topic. The interesting, you mentioned Dr. Ben Bickham. He's very deep into the space of insulin resistance too. And it's, to think that we can measure this, the amount of blood sugar in our running through our body that is being counted by the brain through insulin release. So we're literally seeing this seesaw between what we put in our body, what our brain is releasing as a hormone to store and to carve up into energy, and what is stored as fat. And what is and how this becomes potentially a chronic disease when we put too much in. One of the issues that a lot of people are battling with is exposures to environmental toxins. How have you? There's been a few really interesting episodes on toxins such as mold and how these are really affecting people's both for chronic health conditions, but also the mind as well.
Yeah, when I think about environmental toxins and I think about the body is always looking for balance. The body always is looking to um, operate in its health. Crazy sometimes when you talk to people about their health and if they have low energy levels or their brain isn't working the way that it wants to. In this world of doctors that I typically interview a lot in the world of functional medicine, one of the core concepts that they talk about a lot is that our most diseases that we suffer from today, including things that are not diseases, but more like syndromes, if somebody has chronic fatigue syndrome or low energy or whatever it might be, or even just basic things like brain fog, the body is not making a mistake. It's usually trying to survive something. So the question becomes, we actually have a mutual friend, Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, who did a great TED talk a few years ago, called I think it's called The End of Diseases, right? Or making diseases disappear. And inside of that TED talk, and he's been on the podcast a few times, he really drills home this idea that the body is simply trying to survive. So we may have a name for that disease. We call it Alzheimer's, or we call it, let's say Graves' disease, or we call it Hashimoto's, for example. But the body doesn't know the name of that disease. It's just trying to adapt. So let's take some of the autoimmune diseases that are out there, like MS. We had Terry Walls on the podcast. Terry Walls is a medical doctor out of Iowa who is a researcher in the space of multiple sclerosis. And she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And we had her on the podcast. She's about to come back. And one of the things that she really believes that part of the degradation that came to her ending up with this autoimmune condition, which wreaked havoc on her life for many years, was the different environmental toxins that she was exposed to as a young woman growing up on a farm. They used to literally take pesticides, all sorts of things. I think even DDT, which is a banned pesticide today, and they would spray it liberally on the farm without any hazmat suits or anything to protect their body. And now more and more research is coming out there that these pesticides, these environmental toxins, even things like mold that's very common in the home, heavy metals and lead that's in our water systems all across the US, these environmental toxins, the easy way to think of them is they're another version of stress on the body. They put stress on different organ systems. So now our body is fighting this thing. It's trying to do its normal daily survival mechanisms, detox the body, maintain balance, energy, allow us to have enough, focus to perform, procreate, do all the things that we need to do. And on top of that, we're adding in another stress. Interestingly enough, a lot of these environmental toxins have also been shown to become obesogens inside of the body. They can actually make you pro-inflammatory and make you gain weight. So some of the experts, the things that they're highlighting is that mold isn't just this thing that grows on food that we have when we see food that's moldy, we toss out, but that actually we have long-term chronic exposure at levels that we never had when we were, more in our head because of our modern lifestyle. So in the instance of mold, many of our houses in the Western world, but also in other parts of the world that have modern housing, Australia, England and a lot of other countries, that as countries start to develop more modern housing, they become ecosystems for mold because we're good. If we have a small leak under our sink or in our walls when it rains, we are now preventing that mold from being exposed to the natural things in the environment that would cause it to be potentially removed, like other forms of plant species or fungus or sunlight in certain instances. And I think the more that people become aware that our modern lifestyle, which is trying to do so much good, is also end up creating environmental toxins that we're chronically exposed to, the more that they can start hunting down what are some of the possible triggers that could be connected to the chronic disease that they're suffering from.
It's really when you interview people like Dr. Terry Walls, it really makes me think, and it's a trend I've seen too, is that there's something about the practitioner's journey being in and amongst a condition and then both understanding from a personal point of view and then a patient point of view to really start to bring these solutions out. I mean, her story is absolutely fascinating. In terms of how she reversed, a chronic autoimmune disease in multiple sclerosis, but then how she's gone back and nitpicked the science and thought about the processes that the disease undertakes through the body in order to reverse them. Have you seen? I mean, obviously, she's one of the best examples. But have you seen a trend of this in other practitioners that have gone through personal experience and then have gone out to help others? Is this something that you think is really kind of driving this movement?
I think it is. A perfect example is my business partner, Dr. Mark Hyman. He originally had exposure to environmental toxins that started his journey. He was offered this incredible opportunity to build a group of I wouldn't say functional medicine clinics, but more sort of integrative clinics in China. And so he was in China, and this was like the late 90s, early 2000s. And in that period of time, he was working, I believe, in Shanghai. And Shanghai is one of the top at that time, and still today, had one of the worst air quality in any sort of major cities across the world because of all the factories that were built in sort of the cities and the coal power plants that were there. And he used to go in and clean out his air filter manually. He had no awareness that environmental toxins could wreak havoc on his body and brain. And inadvertently, without knowing it, and cleaning out all this coal dust that would accumulate in his filters, and just the combination of him also having certain genetic exposure to it, he ended up completely breaking his brain and his body through exposure to environmental toxins, especially also mercury was one of the toxins that he was exposed to through coal and other compounds over there. And that, you see, is often the impetus for, when medical doctors go to school, and I have a lot of them. In fact, I'm recording this out of my brother-in-law's house here in San Diego. He's a medical doctor. He's a cardiologist here in San Diego. And, when most medical doctors and researchers are really smart, physicians, PhDs go through school, they're really taught that that their understanding of the way that the world works, or pathways happens, or chronic disease happens, is sort of the final word, at least until medicine shows differently. And for a lot of the researchers and doctors that we've had on the podcast, for most of them, it was getting exposed, either themselves or a family member, to some chronic disease that they didn't have the answers for, that started to open their eyes and ask questions. So for almost a good year and a half, Dr. Hyman was not able to focus, had low energy, could not perform at his best capacity. And he started just asking questions of, why is this happening? And more importantly, is there something that I could do about it? So he's a great example, in addition to Terry Walls and that example that you mentioned. In fact, the Institute of Functional Medicine sent out a survey, and they asked the doctors and the practitioners that are part of the database, they asked them, how did you get into the world of functional and integrative medicine? And the vast majority of them responded that it was a personal health crisis or a health crisis of a family member that opened their eyes and had them start asking different questions in this space. And that's how they're practicing the way that they're practicing now.
So true. The personal, there's also there's a lot of writing in Eastern medicine talking about how the practitioner walks his path with the patient. It's really interesting. I think maybe Western medicine disconnects ourselves a little bit from this idea that we are, part of that journey with the patient, and that really becomes, how the patient heals is when we get this much deeper understanding. We talked about Rangan Chatterjee, which most people would probably be familiar with. He's created such a movement of lifestyle-based medicine with really simple, he breaks things down so simply, right? And that's probably one of his biggest skills, right? What would you say is, a doctor like Rangan, what would you say are his skill sets in terms of distilling information? How has he been so successful in helping so many people to heal? What would you say are his qualities that are, really kind of pushing his, getting his message out there of, helping people heal?
Yeah, I would say Rangan, and also the doctor that introduced us, Rupi. aka the Doc's Kitchen, a mutual friend of ours who made a connection between us. And I think both Rupi and Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, Dr. Rupi and Dr. Chatterjee, are both great examples of this modern movement. And I have so much respect for these types of positions. I would say Dr. Andrew Huberman is another one, Dr. Peter Attia, Dr. Casey Means. There's this growing group of clinicians who are starting to understand that practicing medicine is not just about one-on-one patient care, that actually we can leverage the best of social media and take all the research that's out there and give practical tools that are low cost to no cost that anybody can implement in their life. And that's one of the things that I think that especially Dr. Rangan Chatterjee does extremely well, because we're all so busy. We all can't be students of spending hours a week researching and listening to podcasts. Most people are just trying to show up and do a great job at work and be there for their kids and provide for their families. So what they need is they need the essence. They need the essence distilled down to them in a way that can meet them at where they are right now. So on a very simple level, I was mentioning about metabolic health earlier and keeping balanced blood sugar. Let's take something so simple that everybody can walk away with from this podcast that came from some of the research that I did and some of the folks in our podcast. So growing up, grandparents always talked about, they didn't even talk about it, they just did it. After we would eat a meal, especially dinner, we would all go on a walk together as a family. And they were so insistent on it. And I remembered because dinner time growing up with my grandparents was also very close to a lot of the shows that I wanted to watch in the evening on television. So I would resist a little bit and said, do we have to go on a walk? Are you sure this is something that we have to do? And they were like, no, it's part of our tradition. Our parents and grandparents did it with us, so we got to do it as well too, right? And then recently, as I've been wearing a continuous glucose monitor, I'm using one from this company called Levels, but people use one from all different companies that are out there. One of the interesting things that I've seen in experiments that I've done is that when I eat a meal that is, let's say, even a slightly more carbohydrate rich than I would normally eat, and after that meal, if I go on a walk versus if I'm just sedentary and I lie on the couch, just going out for a walk after eating a meal significantly can bring your blood glucose down to a level that's in the optimal range, which is usually, and the measurements are different around the world, but the optimal range would be somewhere between 70 and like 110, keeping your glucose in that sort of optimal range. In fact, the company Levels found this to be so impactful that they did this challenge recently that I'm going to be participating in, and I'll post it online on social media. They're having a bunch of people drink a can of Coke. Probably even I haven't drank a can of Coke in maybe about at least 15 years. And they're going to have us drink a can of Coke to show people how simple things that we can do in our lives to balance blood sugar, keep our metabolic health at great levels so that we can avoid prediabetes, so that we can avoid even and start addressing things like impotence in men. One of the most common metabolic disorders in women is PCOS, which is the leading cause of infertility. So this has real implications in our life. So the Coke challenge is, and this is not an endorsement of Coke. I told you I haven't drank Coke in years, probably at least 15, 20 years. I haven't drank a can of Coke. They're going to have us drink a can of Coke on our own and then just sit on the couch or sit in a chair. And they're going to have a drink a can of Coke and then immediately go on a brisk walk outside. And they kind of given us a little bit of a preview of the difference that a walk makes. And it's so significant when it comes to regulating and balancing our blood sugar. And that's something that anybody can do. So the reason that I think people love Rupi and Doctor's Kitchen and Dr. Rangan Chatterjee and other individuals out there, I would say, Stephen, you're really good at making these things tangible, is that we need simple things that we can do and start on today that don't cost anything to make health real, tangible, and immediately impactful in our lives.
Yeah, I really agree, because a lot of times, especially when patients are sitting in the chair, they'll be sitting with this problem that they've had for a very long time, and they really need step by step ways to at least get them on the path. Because one, they need to understand that there is an explanation and a solution. But once they start to see that there are steps out of it that they can take every day and they can start to make progress, you start to see their energy change and their mindset change on what is actually afflicting them. And it's a big shift in how I find that people deal with chronic issues, and especially in the online space, it is so crucial to to be able to break things down, which is what you do so well, Dhru, which is why this is such a great conversation, because people need this information distilled down, like forget the the scientific jargon. How do we do this, and what can we apply? That's a really interesting study.
And Stephen, if I could jump in for a second to add on to that, diet, especially with the diet wars of what's better, vegan or keto or carnivore, that gets so much attention, and maybe even unnecessarily so. Sometimes we've seen that, especially when we've gone through a rough year like the last year, that actually one of the best ways to move forward in our health, it could be just focusing on the area that we are suffering with the most. And sometimes it's not always diet. It could be our sleep. It could be our mental health. I have a group of guys that meet up every week on Thursday morning. We call it Man Morning Thursday. And we get together and we go for a walk in Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles, like Sydney, pretty good year-round weather. So you can walk outside on a regular basis. There's a ton of hikes very close to us within 15, 20 minutes of, wherever you are in the city. And just going and walking with a group that you feel comfortable with and talking about what's on your mind. Some might argue, especially for somebody who's going through a really rough time in their relationship or business, or maybe they're homeschooling their kids. Maybe they don't need to optimize their diet. Maybe they just need to get what's on their chest off their chest. Or maybe they just need to optimize their sleep a little bit more so they wake up feeling a little rested. So that's the other angle of this. I think wellness is becoming a lot more sophisticated. We're learning, yes, number one area of our body is linked to many areas of our body. Just like you talk about with oral health and dental health is actually linked to every other aspect of our body, including a lot of chronic diseases that are out there. Same thing goes with our gut. Our gut is linked to so many different areas. So our body is intricate. And along with that, depending on where you are in life, you really have to figure out the personalized approach to you. So while everybody's debating what the best diet is, it's actually useful to take a step back and say, is this the area that I need the most attention in? Maybe I need to put attention in another area, and that actually is going to take me further along in my health and ultimately closer to my real goals that I want to get closer to.
So true, and the message really resonates forward as to I think a lot of people are suffering from these kind of issues, and the practical steps that can really push them through. It's interesting, talking about the glucose monitoring, because a lot of the evidence, as you discussed, shows that when the body doesn't manage our glucose well, we know the type 2 diabetes epidemic, is upon us, but a lot of the evidence is pushing towards that there is a significant negative effect on the brain. And Dale Breslau's work on Alzheimer's is some of the most, I think, important out there at the moment, and he's really pushing this idea. And you had a great interview with him on the lifestyle inputs to Alzheimer's disease. We've talked about the brain and the effect of our lifestyle, but Alzheimer's disease has also been dubbed type 3 diabetes. Can you tell us a little bit about how doctors like Dr. Bredesen talk about this lifestyle-based neurodegenerative process, and how that is really shaping our perceptions of a very, very scary view of later life?
Well, what's really exciting is that his next book that's coming up, and we're going to have him on the podcast, is actually documenting instances of his approach, the Bredesen protocol, actually beginning to reverse cognitive decline and dementia in certain patients that they've caught it early. Well, I think the main thing for people to understand when it comes to Dr. Bredesen's work is that Alzheimer's is so much more complicated. Dementia, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, which are all different things, but really they are very, very similar too. they have not one cause. It's not just the buildup of this amyloid plaque that we've spent billions of dollars. I think in the US alone, I looked it up last year in my preparation of my interview with Dr. Bredesen. I think we've spent $60 billion on research looking for the miracle drug to address Alzheimer's. And most of that evidence in the past has been focused on trying to address up the buildup of amyloid plaque inside of the brain, thinking that if we could simply remove this plaque, then people who are struggling with Alzheimer's might actually get better. Well, what actually happened after all those, drug trials, and we're recording this in June of 2021, is that many of those medications actually made things worse. So what Dr. Bredesen is saying is that we have to understand that Alzheimer's, like many chronic diseases, doesn't just have one root as to what is causing it or contributing to it. And it has multiple components. We mentioned environmental toxins. He found that a lot of the patients that they were doing their protocols on, and some studies of autopsies of patients with dementia and Alzheimer's found that those patients tend to have higher levels of heavy metals inside of the brain that are there. Now, does that mean that Alzheimer's is caused or created by heavy metals? No, but that is one correlation pathway that's there. You mentioned metabolic health. We know that when individuals who are caught early with cognitive decline are put on more of a ketogenic diet, even that if that's a ketotarian diet, right? If they want to be, vegetarian, even just like a higher fat, healthy diet of vegetarian foods, or even, regardless of which approach they have, that their brain has now a better fuel source to be maintaining its own energy balance. And that leads to less buildup of these plaques inside of the brain, and also more reclaiming of our brain function and pathways that are there. So I think that the biggest thing that the takeaway is from Dr. Bredesen's work is that Alzheimer's is not one thing, it's many things. And if we can start to take on these many things through our lifestyle, we can have significant improvements when it comes to addressing this disease, avoiding it, or potentially, if we get involved early enough, participating in the decline, or at least the less severeness of the disease in the first place if people are struggling with it.
It's really inspiring work, and I highly recommend anyone to listen to your interview with Dr. Bredesen if they haven't yet, because you're a great interviewer and he's a great researcher. So it really makes for excellent content in terms of really how we understand our mind. One of the pillars of Dr. Bredesen's work, and one of the areas of scientific research I've been so interested in, is the connection between sleep disorders and dementia, and the decline in the brain, and how the brain isn't properly clearing itself when we don't sleep correctly. And we mentioned breathing before as a modality for that, but you also mentioned Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is a neuroscientist who talks about the very detailed circadian rhythm balances that are happening during sleep, and how we can better understand these to get better sleep. Can you tell us a little bit more about this forefront, because it's such an interesting interface on how all of this is coming together?
Yeah, if you look up, there's some great articles that are out there on the different science websites and magazines and review papers, where for a long time, we didn't really even fully understand in the medical history a deep understanding of why did even human beings sleep. We knew that it was part of the rest and recovery process, but what exactly was happening? And some of the biggest discoveries that have happened and been more highlighted are that Dr. Andrew Huberman talks about, and some of the other guests on our podcast, is first and foremost that our brain has its own detoxification system. It's the glymphatic system. And at night, especially when we quiet down a lot of the other metabolic functions inside of the body, our brain can actually get some of the resources and the focused attention it needs to basically send out the dump trucks. Imagine that we have a city inside of our brain, and we need to send out the dump trucks at night to go and collect the trash. And along with that, we need to reset and process memories. And we have so many more functions that we don't even fully understand what is happening. So deep rest is so key to our brain especially, but our body as a whole, actually fully detoxing in the way that it needs to and getting rid of junk DNA, programming cellular death for cells that have gone, and have been damaged through a whole sorts of different mechanisms, including heavy free radical exposure and other things like that. And then on top of that, in addition to the glymphatic system, one of the things that Andrew Huberman is well known for is talking about circadian biology and how many of our body's organs individually and our body as a whole have their own biological clocks. And the more that we understand about those biological clocks, the more that we can recreate almost life as a modern day, as a hunter gatherer who was being woken up by the sun, and how at night our body and our brain and our eyes, especially, that their lab does a lot of studies on vision, how at night, especially getting exposed to bright lights, not just blue lights. This is one thing that I learned from Dr. Andrew Huberman. It's not just about being exposed to your iPhone blue light, but it's actually being exposed to any sort of bright lights at night. They found in their lab seem to stimulate wakefulness and stop the production of melatonin and many other factors that produce different hormones inside of our body that cause us to start feeling sleepy and get ready for a deep, restful night's sleep. So it's not just about having your blue light blockers on or minimizing your blue light that's coming from your devices, although that's very important. It's also actually turning down all the lights inside of your home, especially the overhead lights. And if you're going to keep any lights on, they should be kind of eye level or below and just enough for you to get by. Here's a practical area that this made a difference. My fiance, Yasmin, at night would wake up and go use the bathroom like a lot of people, if you drink a little bit too much water. And she would go, and the lights inside of our bedroom bathroom that are there are super bright. You turn them on and they just are really bright. And she would come back to bed and she'd be tossing and turning, and it'd always be really hard for her to fall asleep. And then the nights that she didn't have to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, I noticed that she was fine. She had deep, restful sleep. And after my interview with Dr. Andrew Huberman, one of the things I did is in her bathroom, because we have two different bathrooms, she refuses to share a bathroom with me. I put a little night light and I said, when you go in, don't turn on the main light. Let's just keep this little night light that's there that produces just minimally enough light for you to be able to use the bathroom and wash your hands and everything like that. She would go in the middle of when she had to use the bathroom, wash her hands, come back to bed, and she was still able to fall asleep. So this is how light, especially, and our different biological clocks that happen in our body, and the work of people like Sachin Panda, who's out there, who really sort of proliferated a lot of this content and awareness around these categories. This is how they have a practical effect on our body. So if you're not getting great sleep, that's a great takeaway, is make sure well before you're ready to go to sleep, we're minimizing all the lights inside of our home and trying to keep them at eye level, not just at an overhead level. And then on the flip side, when you wake up in the morning, so many people have a hard time really getting ready for the day, and they kind of feel a little groggy in the morning. Well, what Dr. Andrew Huberman found is that even 10 minutes of sunlight exposure first thing in the morning, going outside and getting that sunlight exposure, that begins the process of a whole bunch of mechanisms. But one that we understand is starting to get the body to flush out some of the melatonin that's inside of there. Sometimes people wake up and they just start their day inside of their home without going outside and getting direct sunlight exposure. And they think, well, I'm up, I'm having my coffee, I'm starting my day, I'm maybe eating breakfast, I'm on emails. But evolved. Our genetics are still millions of years old in how they function and react to things. So going outside and even getting 10 minutes of sunlight in the morning seems to be at least the minimum viable dose in us starting to get ready and be alert and perform our best for the rest of the day.
It's so fascinating where all this is going, because we're talking about really simple inputs into the body, but how powerful they really are. One of the really interesting areas, how light affects the mitochondria and all of these photomodulation ways, that the infrared light and many of the things that we can't even see. So so the UV spectrum that we cannot see, and how it affects our brain. You mentioned the clearing of melatonin. Light literally flicks the switch to serotonin production in the brain, which is one of the major endocrine hormones that runs our daily life. It's just fascinating where all this is going. Dhru, one more area that I've found that you've talked about a lot is the area of how the neural system measures pain. And so the management of the spinal system and also our posture, and how pain through the body can really, one, direct chronic disease, but how it is a chronic disease in itself. There was a really interesting interview you did on spinal care and yoga. It was with I think Dr. Jeremy Brook, who's a chiropractor. How have you seen this space in terms of the body and how it connects to the mind and the brain, and what practitioners are doing to help people with these issues?
Well, there's a reason why in functional medicine, one of the key pillars of health is structural health, because our structural health and the way that our structure, including our spinal system, is organized has a deep impact on the rest of our body. Because, as Dr. Jeremy Brook talked about in the interview that we had with him, our body is booby trapped with all these nerves that are floating around it. And we are fundamentally, as human beings today, modern human beings, we are sitting so much and we're so stationary and not getting anywhere near the level of movement that we previously would have been getting in our evolutionary history. So on a very practical level, for one of my loved ones in my family, one of the things that we found is that I noticed that they would have a hard time breathing, especially later on in the day. And I would notice them, they'd be working at their computer and they would take a really big deep breath and sort of gasp and sort of collect their energy. So they'd be working on the computer and they'd be like, and they didn't notice it. They just were doing this multiple times a day, especially later in the day. So finally, I talked to Dr. Jeremy Brook and a couple other people that were in my sort of ecosystem. And they were saying, a lot of our deep diaphragm breathing, right? Think of our lower diaphragm, our deep breathing at the base of our lungs, which is actually where we have more receptors to store oxygen that we pull in than at the top. Most people breathe from the top of their chest, but really, if you actually watch babies breathing, you can see their stomach going up and down. They're belly breathers. And that's where we want to be throughout our life, is how to deeply oxygenate our body is breathing through our belly. And so these practitioners were telling me that sometimes when people can't deeply belly breathe, and they might have one of the nerves in their neck. I think it was the C3 and C4 in our neck, the discs that are there. When they get compressed from looking down on our phone all day, we're looking down like this, we're sitting too much, we're looking down on our laptop, we can put pressure on the nerve, and that nerve is actually the one that has control of our deep diaphragmic breathing. So I took this loved one into the chiropractor, Dr. Jeremy Brook, and we talked about it on the podcast, and they started to notice that there was a lot of pressure in that C3, C4 disc area inside of the neck, gave some movements and exercises and put them sort of on a maintenance plan. And ever since that time period, we saw that something as fundamental as breathing, which we think of happening as just being natural, we don't need to work on breathing. Well, we actually do need to work on breathing, because our modern lifestyle is so different than how we grew up and how we evolved through a whole bunch of different things, especially sitting, that it actually affects our core area. Well, what happens when we're not breathing deeply inside of our body? Well, the same thing that happens that you taught me about, Stephen, is that when people are not breathing properly at night, because let's say, for instance, they're breathing through their mouth, which means they're not producing enough nitric oxide, not breathing through their nose, because of a whole host of issues that you've talked about on your podcast and I've talked about it, they actually can get caught up in fight or flight. They get caught up in fight or flight, and their body is literally gasping for air. So the crazy thing is, because sitting too much during the day, we could end up putting our place, if we're not careful and we're not doing things like yoga to counteract a lot of that sitting, or taking breaks, or working at a standing desk, we could put so much pressure on our system that we're having a hard time breathing during the day. Then if you have some of the mouth issues at night, you can't breathe at night and you're literally gasping for air. And now something so fundamental that we all take for granted is having stress on it all throughout the day and all throughout the evening. And then you wonder why people are so on edge all the time. And it could be something as simple as them just not having access to deep breathing that prevents their body from being in fight and flight and actually puts their body more into rest and relaxation. So that was just an example of how structural health is so key. And, Stephen, the thing that I think that is so important for us all to walk away from, right, is that our modern lifestyle is putting so many different forms of stressors on our body, and our body is trying to do the best that it can to survive. So a lot of what we call disease or dysfunction is really our just body doing its best. The more that we can untangle some of those things and recreate some of the best of how life used to be, but still embrace a lot of our modern technology and all the beautiful things that we have in this day and age, which I'm so thankful for, the more that we'll be at a place of equilibrium and actually stepping into optimal health. And I know that's what you stand for. And that's obviously what I try to highlight on my podcast in the best way that I can, knowing that I'm probably better at asking the questions and highlighting the research by asking the right questions than I am documenting it and being the person to present all aspects of the latest science. I'd rather ask the questions to get my guest like you to highlight it. But I try to do the best that I can on today's podcast with you.
It was really interesting, because I know you're one of the best question askers in the business, and I highly recommend people go onto your podcast and dive through all of the different areas that you've explored. Where can people find you if they want to explore more?
Yeah. So just type in my first name, which actually has a unique spelling. It's Dhru, but it's spelled DHRU. And just type in Dhru and podcast, and it'll show up on all the great places, Instagram, iTunes, and Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And that's a great place to get a chance to listen. It's completely free, and anybody can download it from wherever.
Well, Dhru, I just want to thank you so much for all the work you've done in joining these and having these conversations and joining these great minds in terms of how we're really trying to push forward this conversation of how people can be better and feel better, and that there are solutions out there. It's just sometimes we just have to dig a little deeper. Just before we end, where do you see all this going? What's on the horizon for you?
Last year, 2020 was such a pivotal year for wellness because the world was suffering so much from really an opportunistic, virus, right? Coronavirus was a super serious thing. And for sure, so many people died, unfortunately, and unnecessarily so. And I think one way to think of it is, hey, a virus wreaked havoc on us as a human species, and we're powerless. And the next time it happens, the same thing's going to happen. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that, hey, the world is really suffering, and our metabolic health and a lot of other aspects of our health are not in the best place. And this virus came along that was opportunistic, and it took advantage of that. The more that we become the CEO of our own health and wellness, and the more that we embrace on improving our health, the less likely that whether it's coronavirus or some of the factors that contribute to Alzheimer's or autoimmune conditions, the more resilient we're going to be, the more that we take control of our health. So I see so many people, Stephen, I see so many more people interested in wellness than ever before. I see more companies being built in the space. I see more apps and technologies and devices that are making this more accessible for people. And I see more free information being put out there. So sometimes we need something really bad, unfortunately, to have people pay attention to the possibility. And also on the flip side, if we are going to look after the most disenfranchised people around the world, right, that do not have access to, can't eat the healthiest or get technology on that, we need to come up with low cost health interventions that anybody can practice wherever they are in the world, so that we as a world, species, the human species, can be more resilient for any pandemic that tries to take advantage of us in the future. So I see more personalization, more awareness, and more interest in health growing just because simply we have to. And I think a lot of people are realizing that if we don't evolve, we're going to end up dying, unfortunately.
It's a great message, and it really has come to the forefront that our health is first. Thank you, Dhru, for doing so much to help people connecting back to their health, and I really look forward to hearing what you've got coming up on the podcast next week. We'll talk
Thank
soon.
you, Stephen. Pleasure. Appreciate you having me on, and I can't wait to have you back on the podcast to talk about the latest findings that you come across.
Sounds good.